Well, good morning, everybody. This is our Sabbath morning program, Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. And we have an interesting program, and I'm hopeful we will have also a good discussion. And I'm going to give it over to Donna, who is going to give us the introduction and the start prayer. Thank you, Donna.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we do. And we can see you too.
Well, you can see me for a second here. There we go. I have to confess that I became so interested in reading about our speaker, whose CV runs to 37 pages and is studded with fascinating titles and recitation of her academic works, lectures, books, articles, many by herself, a number with her husband, John Collins, who's also a professor at Yale, that I forgot what verses I was told to read from the Bible. So perhaps.
Did I tell you again?
Yeah, tell me again. I have Hebrews open, but I can't read.
Hebrews chapter 1,
Yes.
verses 1 through 4.
Okay.
And then I believe is chapter 2 and verse 1.
Okay, I'm reading from the New English because that's the Bible I have and read the most from. When in former times God spoke to our forefathers, he spoke in fragmentary and varied fashion through the prophets. But in this, the final age, he has spoken to us in the Son, whom he has made heir to the whole universe. And through him, he created all orders of existence. The Son, who is the effulgence of God's splendor and the stamp of God's very being, and sustains the universe by his word of power. When he had brought about the purgation of sins, he took his seat at the right hand of majesty on high, raised as far above the angels as the title he has inherited is superior to theirs. Hebrews 2, the first verse. Thus we are bound to pay all the more heed to what we have been told, for fear of drifting from our course. For if the word spoken through the angels had such force, any transgression or disobedience met with due retribution. What escape can there be for us if we ignore a deliverance so great? And that actually was a little more than the first verse of chapter 2 of Hebrews. We'll bow our heads for prayer, and then I will introduce Adela Yarbro Collins at least a little bit. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this Sabbath day and for this class and for this study that we will be having. Thank you for the word you have given us through the Bible and through many of the people that we know. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, Adela Yarbro Collins, as I said, is a magnificent scholar and just stunned me with just perusing her CV, which I was able to get at Yale University's Divinity School site. She is the Buckingham Professor of New Testament Criticism and Interpretation. And criticism and interpretation is what she does in many ways in both her articles, her lectures, and her books. She holds faculty appointments at Notre Dame, where she taught after leaving McCormick Cemetery. There we go. That's Andrews Seminary. And also she taught at the University of Chicago for 9 years before. John, I see you smiling. Sorry. At the University of Chicago, and of course she's been at Yale now for many years. She has an absolutely amazing background. She went to Pomona College, where she majored in history and religion, and of course graduated, as you would imagine, Phi Beta Kappa. She has a Harvard master's and PhD from. She has been a Danforth, a Fulbright, and a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. She studied not only here, but at Tübingen in Germany, which I think impresses the theologians who know more about that seminary far more than I do. She's been president, I think, of almost every known academic religious society, including, I'll mention too, the Society for New Testament Studies and the Society of Biblical Literature, where she, I believe, may still be on the editorial board. Her interests and her academic work, of course, include Mark, on which she has written a major commentary, the book of Revelation, which we'll talk about today. Interestingly, she's also done work in archaeology and has both done some field work and written. One of the titles of her study, for which she received an award, Best Archaeological Review, Biblical Archaeology Review, is titled Satan's Throne, Revelations from Revelation. She's interested in women in the Bible. I thought one of her, a lecture I would have enjoyed hearing was one she gave at Amherst a few years ago, Feminine Symbolism in the Book of Revelation. She, finally, I'd say, she describes herself as a scholar and a believer. So somehow she has managed through all these years of intense scholarship to retain that commitment. I think Matthew's going to perhaps say something about her husband, who they've been married for about 23 years, who's an Old Testament scholar at Yale Divinity School. And Matthew could correct me if I've gotten that wrong. So together, they cover the whole waterfront of the Bible. And so I'm going to turn it back now to Simona.
Yeah, thank you so much, Donna. This was a very interesting introduction that I think it matters, who the people are, what their credentials are, what their knowledge base is. It's always good to listen to people who know more than we do. And in these terms, I think this is an outstanding speaker that we will be listening to today. So, Matthew, not wanting to put you up front, but would you like to tell us a little bit about her husband?
Absolutely. I wasn't aware I would be
just
do that, but I'm happy
it's
to
not
informally. Sure.
Informally, it's not a requirement.
Yeah, I can't get up there with with what Donna just did unless I grab Wikipedia. I'll sort of. This is a great anecdote that illustrates the significant contribution of both Adela and John Collins. If you ever open up their CV, it'll either make you awe-inspired or frightened when you realize that the amount of work it took to get hundreds of publications, not just dozens, not just 3-5 pages, but it just goes on. And then I think even it says selected sometimes, even though it's like over 40-50 pages long. I remember one time I went to John Collins and I said, hey, I saw that you're going to be contributing to this new Oxford volume or something. And he goes, am I? Oh, I've forgotten. I don't remember anymore. And I was like, it's a new publication coming out. So that was the first clue at just the amount of heavily consistent scholarly output that comes out from both of them. Now, I've never had the privilege of taking a class or from even meeting John's wife, Adela. I've only heard amazing things and of course read her scholarship and work. So I'm looking forward as well for her being the speaker. But my experience with John Collins has been I would say about equivalent on the Hebrew Bible side of what I hear from people who speak about her work, which is that he always managed to be interdisciplinary, could always manage to bridge together the large divides in scholarship, and always had a very strong attention to detail. And that was something that he always encouraged students at Yale Divinity School to be very focused on, is being practical, being realistic with where the field of studies is, and respecting the text. And so my experience was a great blessing to study under Dr. Collins, and I know that I think many of us will be blessed as well to hear from Adela today.
I just add one postscript to that. The little bit, she did get rave reviews from students who had taken her course. So
Yeah.
I'm presuming that that's a good reflection of the quality of her teaching.
Yes,
I've always heard amazing things.
Thank you so much, Matthew. David sent us a link for a very short interview with him, and I listened to it this morning. So at some point later, if we maybe have time, we can listen. I think it was very insightful. It's less than 4 minutes, but I think it really speaks to the kind of person that he is and what his focus is. But right now it's time to turn to Monty and to the program that we have scheduled for today. Monty, could you please give us the video for today? Thank you.
I will, Simona, and I just want to point out that I'll just let you direct me when you want to stop the playing of the video, because it is fairly long. I don't know that we'll be able to see all of it.
That's not a problem. Thank you.
No other individual work has had as great an influence on the apocalyptic tradition as the Book of Revelation. Its opening word, which can be translated either apocalypse or revelation, serves as a kind of self-designation. It originally described the content of the work, but eventually became the name of a kind of literature and the ideas and themes associated with it. Although its key images have precedence in Jewish literature and analogies in other early Christian writings, it is from the Book of Revelation that the popular images of Armageddon, the tribulation, the millennium, and the New Jerusalem come. These are very familiar terms in the US. I presume they're not unknown here. Maybe they are. In this lecture, I will place the book in its historical, social, and cultural contexts and consider its message in those contexts. So first of all, the author. The Book of Revelation claims that the proximate mediator of the revelation it contains is a man by the name of John. Since this name was not uncommon among Jews and followers of Jesus at the time, we may not simply assume that this is John, the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, to whom the Gospel of John has also been attributed by Christian tradition. The author of Revelation never refers to himself as an apostle or disciple of the Lord Jesus. Justin, surnamed Martyr, one of the writing in the mid-2nd century, refers to the book and says that the author was John, one of the apostles of Christ. Irenaeus, in the latter half of the 2nd century, refers to the author of Revelation as John, the Lord's disciple. The reliability of this tradition is called into question by two factors. One is the likelihood that the work was composed in the mid-90s of the 1st century. The other is the tradition that John the son of Zebedee was killed because of his loyalty to Christ, apparently before AD 70. The author of Mark seems already to know that they were martyred. The attribution of the Book of Revelation to John the son of Zebedee, therefore, occurred either by mistake or as a way of increasing the authority of the work. The most reasonable conclusion about the authorship of Revelation is that it was written by a man named John, who is otherwise unknown to us. Although John never claims to be a prophet, he describes his work as a prophecy. Further, he comes very close to designating himself as a prophet when he attributes the following words to the revealing angel in chapter 22, verse 9. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers, the prophets. Thus, the author presented himself indirectly as a prophet, that is, as one whose task it was to mediate an intelligible message to his fellow Christians, a message that he claimed derived ultimately from God. John the prophet's intimate knowledge of Jewish scriptures and evidence that he knew Hebrew and Aramaic indicate that he was probably a Jew by birth and a native of Judea. The fact that he addressed several different communities suggests that he was an itinerant prophet, one who moved from place to place rather than a local community prophet, prophesying in each of the places he visited. His presence in Western Asia Minor and his attitude toward Rome may be explained by the hypothesis that he was a refugee from the First Jewish War with Rome, which erupted in 66 and climaxed with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70. I turn now to the date. The earliest statement about the date of the book of Revelation is the remark of Irenaeus that the revelation was seen at the end of the reign of the Emperor Domitian. There is no good reason, I think, to doubt this dating. Irenaeus, for example, doesn't say Domitian was a second Nero, persecuted Christians. He gets that reputation later. There is no good reason to doubt this dating, and Domitian ruled from AD 81 to 96. The most important internal evidence for the date consists of references to a city called Babylon and prophecies of its destruction. It is unlikely that the author was referring to the city in Mesopotamia or to the one in the delta of Egypt, both of which bore that name. The name is not literal but symbolic, as the statement in chapter 17, verse 5 shows. And on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of harlots and of the earth's abominations. The explanation of the mystery or secret in chapter 17, verses 7 to 9, makes clear that the woman represents the city of Rome. She sits on a beast with 7 heads. The heads represent 7 hills on which the woman is seated. The image of the 7 hills was widely used as a metaphor for the city of Rome by well-known writers of the first centuries BC and AD. Furthermore, the woman is identified as the great city that has royal power over all the kings of the earth. At the time John was writing, such a city could only be Rome. It is likely that John took over this symbolic name from Jewish tradition, current in his time. In ancient Jewish sources, Egypt, Kittim, Edom, and Babylon are all used as symbolic or code names for Rome. Kittim, a name that originally referred to the island of Cyprus, is the most common symbolic name for Rome in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Edom is the most common one in rabbinic literature. Most of the uses of Babylon as a symbolic name occur in Jewish apocalyptic works. In each occurrence, the reason for the use of this name is made clear in the context. It is the fact that Rome's forces, like those of Babylon at an earlier time, destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple. The use of the name in Jewish tradition suggests that John used it not only to allude to the great power, wealth, arrogance, and decadence of Rome, but also and most especially to call to mind the events of AD 70. But not necessarily immediately afterward. The 2 great Jewish apocalypses that react to the destruction of 70, 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, were not written immediately after the destruction of Jerusalem, but around AD 100. I turn now to summary of the contents. The book of Revelation opens with a preface in the third person. That is, in it John does not speak, but is spoken about. It is difficult to determine whether the preface was added later by someone else, for example, when the book began to be copied and circulated, or whether John used the third person here as an adaptation of the conventional introduction to prophetic works. In any case, the style and content of the preface are very similar to those of the rest of the work. The preface refers to the work as an apocalypse or revelation that was given by God to Jesus Christ to show his servants what must soon take place. This emphasis on the imminence of significant events is repeated at the end of the preface with the words, "For the time is near." The revelation was mediated in a series of steps from God to Jesus Christ, to an angel, to John, to the servants of God. This mediated character is different from the traditional Israelite prophecy, in which God speaks directly to the prophet, or the prophet somehow becomes present at the divine council. And then the prophet delivers God's words to the people with the phrase, "Thus says the Lord." The book of Revelation, however, is also called words of prophecy, and a blessing is pronounced on the one who reads it aloud, probably in a communal setting, and on those who keep or observe the things written in it. Clearly, this work represents a distinct type of prophecy in which the revelation is mediated rather than direct, and in which the prophet writes to the people rather than, or perhaps in addition to, addressing them orally. Apart from the preface, the book has the framework of an ancient letter. In this part of the work, John speaks in the first person and also quotes other speakers. It begins with the typical opening elements of an ancient letter. The salutation names the sender and the addressees. The greeting, in this case the wish that God and Christ grant favor and peace to the addressees, follows. Then comes a doxology, which takes the place of the thanksgiving that typically occurs near the beginning of the letters of Paul. The work closes with a concluding blessing, typical of early Christian letters. Attached to the epistolary prescript are two prophetic sayings, which hint already that this is not a typical letter. Similarly, a series of prophetic sayings precedes the epistolary conclusion. These sayings enclose what may be called the body of the work, chapter 1, verse 9 through chapter 22, verse 5. This main part is a description of the revelation received by John and an account of how and from whom he received it. The report falls into two main parts: an account of an appearance of the risen Christ to John in chapter 1, verse 9 through 322, and a description of visions and auditions of heavenly origin in 4:1 to 22:5. The second part begins with a vision of the heavenly court, which introduces a series of symbolic visions. I turn now to the question of the structure of the work. It is clear that an organizing principle in the book of Revelation is the number 7. 7 messages, 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and 7 bowls are presented. Some interpreters argue that the number is based on the observance of the Sabbath. That hypothesis seems unlikely, since the Sabbath is never mentioned in the work. John does refer to the Lord's Day in chapter 1, verse 10, which is probably Sunday. It is more likely that the number has cosmic significance. According to late Pythagorean tradition and to the Jewish exegete and philosopher Philo of Alexandria, all reality is ordered, and that order expresses itself in patterns of 7. Jewish writers argued that the observance of the Sabbath is thus in accordance with the cosmic order, but John does not make this point. It is not so clear, however, how each of the series of 7 relates to the others. They manifest parallels among themselves and some repetition. The similarities between the trumpets and the bowls are so close but the latter seem in large part to repeat the former, with just extending the destruction a bit. Some scholars think that this repetition results from the use of written sources. He just put together sources without worrying about how they fit. Others think that it's part of the author's literary design. Within the latter group, some think that the literary design involves a linear sequence of events from beginning to end, whereas others argue that the same events are described repeatedly from different points of view and with different imagery. The theory that the book of Revelation describes the same events from different points of view was adopted by the author of the oldest surviving commentary on Revelation, written about AD 300 by Victorinus of Pettau. He stated that both the trumpets and the bowls predict the eschatological punishment of unbelievers. Victorinus's hermeneutical principle of recapitulation, so repetition with a difference, was taken up by Tychonius as an independent rule in his exegetical work, 3 Books of Rules, written around AD 382. Tychonius then applied this rule in his influential commentary on the book of Revelation, written about AD 385. This commentary has unfortunately been lost, but it was so often quoted that it can be almost completely reconstructed from fragments, and something of its nature can be known from its influence on other writers. The approach to Revelation, pioneered by Victorinus, has been called the recapitulation theory in modern scholarship. The source-critical approach was first applied to the book of Revelation by Daniel Völter in 1882. An extreme source-critical analysis was proposed by Friedrich Spitta in 1889, who argued that the seals, trumpets, and bowls each reflect a different source based on a 7-fold series. In the 20th century still, the source-critical approach was adopted by M.E. Boimard, Josephine Massenburg-Ford, and Ulrich B. Müller. The argument for the extensive use of sources has been undercut by the demonstration of the unity of style in the work as a whole. R.H. Charles argued that the literary design of Revelation describes a linear sequence of events. He concluded that most of the events are given in strict chronological order, but there are significant exceptions. Chapter 12, the vision of the woman and the dragon, is a flashback intended to provide the background for chapter 13, the vision of the 2 beasts. 3 proleptic or anticipatory visions interrupt the orderly unfolding of events in order to encourage the audience by flashing forward to some more distant point of the future. These are the vision of the innumerable multitude in the second half of chapter 7, the vision of the mighty angel in chapter 10, and the 2 witnesses in chapter 11, and the 3 visions of chapter 14. The adequacy of this theory was called into question both by these numerous significant exceptions and by the hypothesis that the text had been thrown into disarray by an incompetent disciple of the author after his death. The failure of the attempt to interpret the plan of the book as a linear sequence of events led to the revival of the recapitulation theory. Modern scholars had at first been reluctant to admit the validity of this approach because it had been used in connection with the premise that the book of Revelation prophesied history from the time of its composition to the time of the interpreter, at whatever time the interpreter lived. But Günther Bornkamm was able to show that this theory is compatible with a historical critical approach to the work. That is, with an interpretation that understands the prophecies to refer to the past and present of the author, and apart from that, to the eschatological future, which was future for John and for later the modern interpreter as well. Bornkamm pointed out the close parallel structure between 2 major parts of the body of the work. he argued that the 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and related material describe the same series of events as the 7 bowls and the related material that follows. The part beginning with the seals, however, describes these events in a mysterious, fragmentary, and proleptic manner. Another way of retrieving the recapitulation theory is to argue that the book of Revelation consists of 2 great cycles of visions, one from 1:9 to the end of chapter 11, and the other from the vision of the woman clothed with the sun to the end of the account of the New Jerusalem. The first cycle is made up of 3 series of 7, the messages, seals, and trumpets. The second is made up of a series of unnumbered visions, which you can interpret as 7, but that might be stretching it a bit, 7 bowls, and another series of unnumbered visions. Beginning with the 7 seals, each series expresses the message of the whole book in its own particular way. The constant elements of the message are 3 themes: persecution, punishment of the persecutors, and salvation of the persecuted. These themes are introduced in the first cycle in a way that seems deliberately veiled and fragmentary, just hinting at this phenomenon, or a series of 3 phenomena. The second cycle maintains the symbolic and mythic language of the first, but presents the message of the book in a fuller and more coherent manner. In particular, the second cycle is more explicit about the historical contexts of the visions. The first cycle makes clear that persecution is of major importance, but it is only in the second cycle that the identity of the persecutors is made almost explicit, namely the Roman authorities. Structural, thematic, and text-linguistic approaches have also been offered. Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza discerned a pattern of inclusion, the rhetorical and literary concept of an inclusio, 2 similar things enclosing material in between, inclusion or symmetry in the book of Revelation. She defines the introductory material before the beginning of the account of the appearance of the risen Christ as the first unit of the work. The last unit, most, but not all, of the prophetic sayings that follow the end of the body of the work, chapter 22, verses 10 to 21, forms the 7th and last unit. In her view, these 2 units are related as promise and fulfillment. The second unit is the account of the appearance of Christ, including the 7 messages. The 6th unit includes the material from the coming of Christ on a white horse and some of the concluding prophetic sayings in chapter 22. The 2nd and 6th unit are related because they both contain what she calls an inaugural vision of Christ, the opening epiphany and the eschatological coming. The 3rd unit begins with the throne vision and ends with the 6th trumpet. The 5th unit includes the bowls and the following related material. These 2 are related because both evolve out of the scroll with the 7 seals. Only the trumpets, however, are explicitly connected with the scroll, because the opening of the 7th seal involves 2 or 3 phenomena, one of which is the beginning of the trumpets, the appearance of 7 angels with trumpets. But you don't get any kind of literary connection like that between 11 and 12. That leaves the 4th unit, which consists of the visions of the mighty angel and the 2 witnesses, the 7th trumpet, the woman clothed with the sun, the 2 beasts, and the miscellaneous visions of chapter 14. She argues that this unit is the center and climax of the book. In his text-linguistic study of Revelation, David Hellholm concluded that the level of communication most profoundly embedded in the work is the speech of God that follows the descent of the New Jerusalem from heaven. This speech also occurs on the highest grade of the hierarchy of text sequences. He argued that this hierarchic embedment of divine speech enhances the authority of the message. I turn now to social setting and purpose. The messages to the 7 congregations in the 7 cities reveal conflict among the followers of Jesus in these regions and rivalry among their leaders. Each message is addressed to the angel of the congregation in that particular city. Since angels were equivalent to stars in Jewish tradition, and the angels of the congregations are identified with stars in chapter 1, verse 20, it is clear that John refers to angelic beings in 2:1 and the other messages, not to human messengers. This motif is a democratization of the Israelite and Jewish idea that each people or nation, partial democratization, of the Israelite and Jewish idea that each people or nation has an angel ruling over it as representative and patron. At the same time, however, the address to the angel is a literary device through which the author can address the community as a whole, speaking in the name of Christ. It may be that the author employed this device in order to circumvent the institutional leaders of the congregations, bishops or overseers, elders and deacons, and to lessen their authority. The charismatic authority of the prophet may bypass the institutional authority of the local leaders, just in case they're not on board. The Christians in Ephesus are commended because they cannot bear evil people, but have tested those who call themselves apostles but are not, and found them to be false. They are also praised for hating the works of the Nicolaitans, which Christ also hates. In the message to the followers of Jesus in Pergamum, the teaching of the Nicolaitans is equated with that of Balaam. As you know, according to Numbers 22 to 24, Balaam was a foreign priest and diviner or seer, whom Balak, the king of Moab, paid to curse Israel. Moved by the power of the Lord, however, Balaam blessed Israel instead. But the book of Revelation seems to allude not to these mostly positive accounts about Balaam, but to Numbers 31:16, which says that Balaam counseled the women of Midian to cause the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the matter of Peor. This text, in turn, alludes to the story in Numbers 25, 1-18, according to which some of the men of Israel married women of Moab and Midian, who then persuaded them to worship their god, Baal of Peor. The teaching attributed to Balaam that some in Pergamum are accused of holding involves eating food sacrificed to idols and practicing immorality. It is not entirely clear whether either or both of these activities are meant literally or metaphorically. The eating of food, probably meat sacrificed to idols, is an issue addressed by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 to 10. It could very well be meant literally here. Practicing probably sexual immorality could also be meant literally, but in some restricted sense regarding distinctions between permitted and forbidden types of marriage. It's hard to imagine an early Christian teacher saying, go forth and commit adultery or fornication or whatever. If the terms are taken literally, the controversy here may be related to the so-called apostolic decree reported in Acts 15:29. Another possibility is that both terms are meant to symbolize laxness in monotheistic devotion to the one true God. Harlotry is a term used frequently in the prophetic books of the Jewish scriptures for honor paid to other gods. In either case, the point at issue seems to be how to live as a servant of God and a follower of Jesus in a pluralistic society. In antiquity, as you know, there was no concept of a secular state. Religious, social, economic, and political aspects of life were closely intertwined and embedded in politics, in each other. John evidently disagreed with some traveling and local teachers in Ephesus and Pergamon on this question. The issue is even more explosive in the message to Thyatira. The Christians in that place are criticized for tolerating the woman Jezebel. As Babylon is a symbolic name for the city of Rome, so Jezebel is a code name for a female prophet active in Thyatira. According to the first book of Kings, Jezebel was the daughter of the king of Sidon and a worshiper of Baal. Ahab, the king of Israel, the northern kingdom, married her, presumably to form an alliance with Sidon. Ahab then built a temple for Baal in Samaria. A struggle then followed between the devotees of Baal and those of Yahweh. In the end, Jezebel was thrown from a window and her body eaten by dogs. John's endowment of the otherwise anonymous prophet with the name Jezebel is already a harsh commendation of her teaching. It is described in the same way as that of Balaam, practicing immorality and eating food sacrificed to idols. The words attributed to Christ hint that her teaching also involved the deep things of Satan. This phrase could be understood to mean that her teaching was similar to Gnostic speculation, or that she was involved in the practice of magic. It could, however, simply mean that she taught apocalyptic mysteries, that is, secrets about heaven or the future. These could be revealed interpretations of texts that she associated with Satan, or the evil angels associated with him. Such teaching would be intelligible entirely within the context of Jewish and Christian apocalypticism. But we do not have sufficient information to be sure what this teaching was. The messages also reflect a social setting in which followers of Jesus are in conflict with their Jewish neighbors. Although the movement that originated with the historical Jesus could still be defined as a type of Judaism at the time John was writing, even from a modern scholarly point of view, it is likely that some social differentiation had taken place. The use of the term ecclesia, assembly, congregation, or church, in the book of Revelation indicates that followers of Jesus in each city had their own association, separate from the synagogue, the gathering or the synagogue, the assembly of the local Jewish community. In the message to Smyrna, the speaker refers to the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Those who say that they are Jews and are not could be Jewish people or Christians following a Jewish way of life. They could, for example, be Gentiles by birth who argue that those who would share in the benefits of Christ must be circumcised and observe all or some of the commandments of the Torah. This line of interpretation seems unlikely, however, since John shows no interest in the theological principles dear to Paul, such as salvation by faith rather than by works of the law. Furthermore, the rhetorical force of the saying implies that Jews is a positive designation. The implication is that the ecclesia, the association of followers of Jesus, is the synagogue of God, and that the local Jewish community, which does not recognize Jesus as the Messiah, is the synagogue of Satan. Now, this text obviously is a very dangerous text for later contexts in which it could be, and I'm sure has been used in an anti-Semitic way, but it's typical polemic at the time, even an inner Jewish polemic. It's analogous to the polemic of the sectarian movement associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls against other Jews who have not joined them in their new covenant with the Lord and the proper interpretation of the Torah that has been revealed to them. For example, the community rule states, "They shall separate from the congregation of the men of falsehood and shall unite with respect to the law and possessions under the authority of the sons of Zadok, the priests who keep the covenant, and of the multitude of the men of the community who hold fast to the covenant." The men of falsehood are equivalent to the men of the lot of Belial. So Belial is the chief of all evil spirits and demons, so equivalent to Satan. The similarity is especially strong in a passage from the Thanksgiving hymns, where the probably Jewish opponents of the community are designated, quote, a council of deceit and a congregation of Belial, unquote. Immediately following the reference to the synagogue of Satan in Revelation 2:9, the author gives encouragement in the face of persecution. John uses the word tribulation to speak of the sporadic persecutions that have already happened and continue to occur, and for the persecutions that he expects to happen in the future. In the message to Smyrna, the speaker says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." These words imply expectation of official arrest and imprisonment, presumably to await trial. At the time John was writing, and for more than a century afterwards, Roman officials did not seek out Christians to arrest and interrogate them. They took action only when a citizen or a resident with civil rights brought an official accusation or charge against Christians in accordance with the normal legal process. The juxtaposition of a polemic about the synagogue of Satan and the encouragement in the face of persecution suggests that in Smyrna, conflict between Christians and Jews had led or seemed about to lead to the formal accusation of Christians by Jews before the Roman authorities. The charge could have been disturbing the peace or introducing a new cult, which almost by definition would be unlawful or subversive. The message to the congregation in Philadelphia also mentions a synagogue of Satan, and those who say that they are Jews and are not, but lie. The promise in this message that those who claim to be Jews will come and bow down before the feet of the congregation and know that Christ has loved them expresses the hope for a reversal of the present situation in which the Christian congregation has little or no status or power, not even from their fellow Jews, so to speak, as John viewed it. The need to endure and the need to avoid denying the name of Christ are prominent themes in the messages. These themes reflect a social situation in which it is difficult to maintain the identity of the group in light of the dominant symbolic system and lifestyle, and in which there is active opposition to Christian communities. The messages reveal tensions between Christians and non-Christian Jews. It is likely that there were tensions between Christians and non-Christian Gentiles as well. As I already noted in discussing the date of the book of Revelation, the work manifests great antipathy to Rome because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Another point of potential conflict was the imperial cult. This issue begins to emerge in chapter 12. The revelatory report in chapter 12 consists of a vision with 3 scenes and an audition that interprets the second scene of the vision. The first and third scenes constitute a birth narrative in which a superhuman female figure gives birth to a son with a heroic or divine destiny. A great monster threatens mother and son, but the mother receives divine aid and the child is saved. This narrative has similarities with several types of ancient texts and roots in the Hebrew Bible as well, but it is most similar to a group of stories about Leto, a Titan goddess, giving birth to Apollo in spite of the pursuit of Python, a monster who rightly fears that Apollo will take his place as ruler of Delphi and its oracle. During the early period of the Roman Empire, Roman rule was likened to the golden age of Apollo. Think of Virgil's 4th Eclogue. And various emperors were identified as Apollo manifest or incarnate. John co-opts this imperial propaganda to claim that the true golden age will come with the messianic reign of Christ. Immediately following the vision of the mother and her child is the vision of a beast rising out of the sea. This vision is a rewriting and adaptation of the vision of the 4 beasts from Daniel 7. At the end of the vision that precedes that of the beast, the monster who threatened the woman, a great dragon, is shown standing on the sand by the sea. It is implied that the dragon watches or even summons the beast rising from the sea. The implication is that the beast is the agent of the dragon. This impression is confirmed by the statement that the dragon gave the beasts its power, its throne, and great authority. Another statement in the vision of the beast reinforces the point. People worshipped the dragon because he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who is able to make war with it?" Since the dragon is identified with Satan in chapter 12, verse 9, the beast is presented as an ally or agent of Satan. In the original context of Daniel 7, the 4 beasts represented the Babylonian Empire, the Medes, the Persians, and the Greeks. The Jewish historian and client of the Flavian emperors, Josephus, provides evidence that the 4th beast was understood to be Rome in the 1st century AD. That the beast of Revelation represents Rome is clear. Authority was given to it over every tribe and people and tongue and nation. Rather than describe 4 beasts, each more terrible than the last, John has combined the attributes of all 4 to create one overwhelmingly monstrous creature. The result is a reduction of attention to history and a focus on the terrors of the recent past and the present. The vision of the beast from the sea makes clear what the dominant concerns of John are. Like the beasts of Daniel 7, this beast, that is Rome, is portrayed as rebelling against God and thus becoming an adversary of God. This theme is invoked by the very image of the sea monster. It is made explicit by the motif of the blasphemous names upon its head and the mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. This theme reaches its climax in the statement, "It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven." So far, the language of conflict is symbolic or mythic, but then it becomes clear that the conflict has a historical dimension. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. This statement may be understood in 2 ways. It reflects the incidents of persecution that have already taken place. For example, the execution of Antipas, mentioned in the message to Pergamon. It also reflects the persecution that John expects to occur in the future. It probably also refers to the first Jewish war with Rome, which began during the reign of Nero. The Roman forces were at first under the command of the military leader Vespasian until he was proclaimed emperor. His son Titus then took over the command. It was he who led the siege of the Temple Mount and under whose command the temple was burned and the city largely destroyed. Later he succeeded his father as emperor. Thus, the Romans made war on the saints and conquered them. Here, the saints are the people of God. In Daniel 7, the saints or holy ones are angels, and the people are the people of the saints of the Most High. The blasphemous names and haughty or blasphemous words evoke not only rebellion, but also the imperial cult. Worship of the living emperor was not a typically Roman phenomenon, but was popular in the East. In the cultures of Mesopotamia and Egypt, it was traditional to view the king or pharaoh as a deity manifest or incarnate. The Greeks had a tradition of honoring the special dead with hero cults and of honoring living benefactors with religious rituals. When Alexander the Great conquered the Near East, he accepted and apparently even encouraged the peoples he ruled to give him divine honors. His successors did the same. Various ruler cults appeared among the Greeks during the Hellenistic period. When Roman hegemony was established in the Eastern Mediterranean area, various cities established cults in which divine honors were given to Roma and Augustus, and then various other emperors and their families, often while they were still alive. It is clear that these cults had important social and political functions. They expressed gratitude to Rome for creating social and political stability, and were part of a system of benefaction and patronage. Simon Price has argued that the imperial cult in the Hellenistic cities resulted from the attempt by Greek subjects of the Roman Empire to relate their ruler to their own dominant symbolic system. The imperial cult was a ubiquitous and impressive phenomenon in the Roman province of Asia, in which the 7 cities of Revelation were located. No resident could overlook it. The cult was celebrated not only in temples, but also in the major civic centers, the meeting place of the council, the theater, the stadium, and the gymnasium. The emperor was regularly associated with the traditional gods, and sometimes presented as a god himself. For example, gold was normally used only for statues of the gods, but it was also often used for those of emperors. Images of the emperors were often carried in processions. Finally, many of the coins in use carried the portrait of the emperor, often depicted as Zeus, Apollo, or Hercules. John's disapproval of the imperial cult is displayed in the statement that all who dwell on earth will worship the beast, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. In the account of the Last Judgment, it is said, if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. To conclude, the book of Revelation is not a prediction of the timing of the end of the world. It is a work of religious poetry, inspired by the prophets of Israel and by the cosmic and political myths of old and of the author's time. The author, an early Christian prophet by the name of John, believed himself authorized by God and his Messiah to interpret the times for his contemporaries. His message was harsh and demanding, both for insiders and outsiders. Insiders were to avoid compromise with the corrupt and idolatrous culture of the cities of the province of Asia, no matter what the cost. John envisaged some chance for the repentance and conversion of outsiders, but for the most part, outsiders were expected to continue doing evil and to be condemned to eternal torment or perhaps annihilation in the lake of fire. The book of Revelation is also a work of religious rhetoric, intended to shape the beliefs and lifestyle of its audience. Historically speaking, it may have contributed to the survival of a Christian perspective that could not simply take its place as one cult among many. Theologically and ethically speaking, it is a work that expresses the anguish of those who live on the margins. It expresses a vision of hope for the marginalized themselves and makes vivid and intelligible for the comfortable how the world of power relations looks from a perspective on the margins. Thank you for your attention.
And this would be a good place to stop our presentation, Monty. Thank you so much. So I'm proposing that we take a brief break. It is now 11:33 on the West Coast. So probably we can return around 11:45. And I will see you then. Thank you. Welcome back from the break. Monty, could you please play that really short video about John Collins and interview with him? Thank you.
Once again, we start our questions and remarks with the younger generation.
In large part, what I try to communicate on the Bible is how to think about it critically. It should give you more questions than answers. It's not a particular set of instructions, but it's the sense of what is right and what is wrong, and what our priorities should be, and what our goals should be in society. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been teaching a course called What Are Biblical Values? Part of the point of the course is what biblical values are not. The answer to that is more or less everything you read in the media. This has much more to do with things like social justice than with things like homosexuality, which gets 2 verses. The whole idea of justice, as you get it across the ancient world, is basically a matter of protecting the weak from the powerful. Now, what you'll get from the Bible is a sense of protest about that, a sense that you ought to be doing something about it. The essence of apocalypticism, you might say, is first of all the belief that you have a higher revelation that nobody else has, and the complex of ideas that we associate with the end of the world. Now, how should an informed person look on that? Well, the first thing you should know is that people have expected the end of the world almost every 10 years for the last 2,000 years or so. The strong point of apocalypses, if you like, is that they help people get through hard times. The weak point of apocalypses is it doesn't leave you with much once you have got through the hard times. Because if you're pinning your hopes on an imminent transformation of the world, this may get you through the week, but it's not going to get you through a lifetime. And so you have to find another way of understanding this. And you have to ask instead, why do people entertain ideas like this? What I see us as doing is primarily training the mind. This is an element of liberal education, where we're asking people for the time they're here to think about the big questions in life. So it's not just a matter of what do you need to do to get a higher degree. It's a matter of what would you really want to do with this subject? What kind of effect would you want to have on society? And what kind of a person would you like to be yourself by the time you get finished with it?
Thank you, Monty. I thought that this short video actually was very important for our discussion, and it kind of gives an insight into kind of thinking that we should be considering when we discuss Revelation as any other part of the Bible. So since we have 2 people in our group today, Matthew and John Johns, who have probably more knowledge and experience in these things, I would appreciate if either you would have a comment, and then after we would go to our discussion, which Monty is going to moderate. So John or Matthew, let me know which one of you wants to start first. I'm sorry, I'm a kind of person who does call people out. So John, I see that you have unmuted. Please go ahead.
I unmuted myself simply so that I can defer to my friend Matthew. Matthew, do you want to give the ball a first kick here?
I was going to, if you didn't speak up, I was going to defer and say, Dr. Jones, would you like to go ahead?
Well, only this, and I'm so pleased that this group are pursuing these questions of how we read Revelation. This is a well-chosen topic, very timely, and being handled, I think, very well with these presenters as we've lined up. Now, I think for the moment, it's just enough to simply quickly say that Adela Yarbro Collins, who has helped a whole generation of students of apocalyptic and of Revelation, I think in this particular presentation has just demonstrated the power of a preterist reading of the text. That is to say, recognizing that apocalyptic literature is not an exception to the basic rule that all of scriptural writings were given in a particular time and place for which they were relevant and pertinent. I think that apocalyptic literature has been the last refuge, in a way, of people who want to deny the historical, analytical, or historical critical way of reading the text by inquiring into the forces that first gave rise to any biblical material as addressing its time and place. Now, there's much more we can say about this. We can pick it up and unpack it further if we wish. But yes, even Revelation is most helpful when we first read it with reference to its situation in those 7 literal congregations in Asia Minor 2,000 years ago. And I think one of the best ways that Adela Yarbro Collins has helped us is by simply showing the self-evident value of that. Now, there's much more that could be added, but Matthew, do you want to pick that up from there?
I can. I think the first comment I was going to make was that Dr. Collins, John Collins, went ahead and published a book about the class he was speaking about, and so you can get that book from Yale University Press. It's called "What Are Biblical Values?" And it happened. I'm currently teaching at La Sierra University the class on biblical ethics in the modern world, and we're using among our textbooks Collins' book as a conversation starter. So I'd definitely encourage anyone who is intrigued by that video, go ahead and check out the book. It's written in a very cordial style, not like a typical academic monograph. But I think that the real value in sometimes approaching the Bible from these perspectives is to think about the fact that these are written by real people in real circumstances, and that there's a real mystery about it. But also, I think what's important is to realize that sometimes the rumors are hyped. What is the rumors of my death have been very largely exaggerated. Sometimes people, and this is more due to the marketing of, I think, conservatives, there's this frightened fear factor of preterism as being an enemy of any potential prophetic nature of a text to speak to the present. And I think the difficulty is that preterism, it's not the whole story, much in the way that materialism is not the whole story, but material reality still exists, and you might think there's more to it than simply your nerves are kicking in. You might not be okay with just referring to things through the material reality. You might think that love actually exists outside of some nerve impulses. Nonetheless, the nerve impulses are real and they're there, and preterism can be a very helpful tool to understand one aspect of what this text was speaking to, that the original audience is going to be, wrestling with at the first stage. And of course, I presented at ASRS in 2019 a paper. I don't remember, John, if you were there, but it was on looking at the early views of Antiochus Epiphanes in the books of Maccabees with Ellen White and the 1919 Bible Conference. And many there of the early Adventists understood a sort of double fulfillment understanding of how to make sense of Daniel's prophecies and other prophecies, such that they were not concerned if on one level Antiochus Epiphanes fulfilled it, but in a greater level the papacy was to fulfill other elements. So I think it's important to realize that there really isn't a war between preterism or historicism or idealism, that idealism being the idea that it's a reoccurring pattern that keeps popping up and needs to be reapplied as Babylon anew. There isn't a war. It's more of a question of how do we come to have a more deep understanding and a more rich conversation about the various levels of depth that the text holds, both in its history, but as well as our own meaning making. So that's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, I will not preempt the ongoing conversation, except to simply underscore with you that a preterist reading does not preclude an idealist reapplication of the text, as any good reader response theoretician would recognize. The difficulty, rather, is that when we take a continuous historical reading, which would want to, for example, line up the seven churches sequentially, and make that become the one and only, the absolute single meaning of the text, then we deprive ourselves of the value of the text in many ways and really get ourselves into trouble in a hurry. I won't beat that drum further. I'll just say it for the moment.
Thank you both, John and Matthew. I think it's really important for us to understand that the Bible has never been either or in the reading. It is always both and. So just because there is a message that was sent to particular people of that particular time by the book of Micah, for example, doesn't mean that we can't read that same book today and find something in it that speaks to us. And the same should be, is true for the revelations as well. And so as we all read the prophecies in the Bible, there are very often prophecies that were directed to the people who lived right there and then. But we all read and are enriched by these prophecies, by these understandings of what is important. And I think that in this context, I really like that short interview with Dr. John Collins, where he spoke about justice. You know, justice is the prevailing value on of the Bible in general, and how do we treat the marginalized and the oppressed and so on and so on. And so in this context, also looking at the book of Revelation, you know, as the book of justice, as the book that speaks of this return of justice to the world that is in need of it, and both in contemporaneous way and our current, you know, in continuous way, historically speaking. So I'm going to turn this over now to Monty for the conversation and your questions and comments. I see that Anastasia is raising, or Stephen are raising their hands, and then Monty, please take over. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Simona. And I did see that hand raising. We'll go there. Just a brief reminder about our discussion guidelines. One question per spot in the queue, to include a brief comment and directly related follow-up question if needed. And also my priorities will be in the queue will be first questions and gender balance of questions. So with that, I'm going to invite further hands and go to Anastasia or Stephen.
Stephen first, yeah.
Thank you. This was a very, very informative presentation, and a couple points of clarity that were really helpful, and that is that the author of Revelation is not the same as John the Apostle. That was really important because that was something that I had surmised some time ago, because of the reflection of the nature and the character of God in from the Gospel of John is very different than that which we see in Revelation. The second is that we're understanding the historical context, and that this is a person writing from a Hebraic tradition primarily, and a Christian tradition secondarily, from my from my view, and that is that he's talking to 7 churches that are predominantly Christianized Jews, but he's talking from an Old Testament perspective because obviously the Jews had a great deal of antagonism toward Rome and what happened in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is a tome to that retribution for those events, in my view. And also that these are churches that are on the margins in that culture, in that society at that time, and are suffering persecution. So they themselves are looking for some resolution that finalizes the persecution they're experiencing and gives them something to see that resolves all that. I think all those contextual things are really important. My one question, and I didn't think that was addressed in the presentation, was, and Anastasia has mentioned this as well, the presentation in Revelation of the nature and the character of God is diametrically opposite that which we receive in the New Testament through Jesus. So that was an unanswered or unaddressed issue, and I would have appreciated some venture in that direction. Thank you.
And if I may, if you allow me just a little bit more, I am a certified literary critic for the classics, the biblical, as well as the French with certain themes. And I'm very, very relieved. Thank you for these wonderful and amazing scholars, as well as the 2 people that spoke before, because the opening of this, it was such a distortion of Jesus and God's nature that I can breathe easier. Having said that, if I add a little bit of this amazing lady scholar, it's true that the Alexandrians, Philo, and especially Dionysius of Alexandria, these were great classicists, but as well great philosophers and theologians, and among others that in the 3rd century departed. Quite a few of them, still some of the original fathers remained believing that John was the same John, but quite a few of them, most of them actually departed from that belief, and and she explained very well in the reasons. As a critics, we take the language, we take the style, we take the content, we take the history, and then thematically, and then we come to the nature of God. So there were several ones, like had told Dana, that they didn't believe was the same person. That's one thing. One thing that remained, and I was greatly inspired as well by her husband, and to zero into God's will and moral issues. And Dr. Hayes has a book about contemporary moral issues of the New Testament, and we come to justice and the nature of God. So interpretation of the symbolism is one thing, but they're clear. And that's why I'm a little bit surprised that people that judged, or not judged hardly, righteously judged certain interpretations of nature of God in some of the Old Testaments that was not according to Jesus, that did not criticize that in the Adventist, at least, interpretation of the book. For instance, there, besides the symbolism there, clearly it departs from the Christian. It's much more Jewish about do the commandments, about the God who sends pestilence, about the God that is full of hatred, about the God that curses, about the totally, I mean, it's really schizophrenic if you read that, and then you read the Epistle of John, on the Gospel of John, about the nature of God, because when we get wrong who God is, who Christ is, what his nature is, I think this is very anti-Christ. And I'm very grateful. One more thing, a little bit of a small, if not correction. Yes, there was anti-Semitism. At the same time, when Paul wrote the letters about there's no Greeks, there's no Romans, so on and so forth, the historical facts were. that they Christianized the Jews that had become Christians. The ones of the church of the Ecclesia of Jerusalem had sent Paul to go to the churches in mainland Greece, like Corinth and especially Thessalonians. They were supporting with their money those ecclesias of the Jewish churches like James that had become Christians. Yet that Jewish ecclesia that had become Christian were forbidding other Christianized Jews to worship in the same place, in the same ecclesia, to intermarry, and that they had to become and be Jews first. And even then, after the pagan Christians became Jews first by circumcision, etc., food, etc., 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 still did not want not to intermarry. These are historical facts, to intermarry or to worship in the same ecclesia. So yes, there was some anti-Semitism. At the same time, I think the Greeks at that time, the pagan Christians or the Hellenized Jews were right to be angry with them. And then this person, John, whoever it is, to say they're Jews, but they're not really Jews, etc., 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 where they were the ones that were very prejudiced and hating. And I understand because of Rome. Nevertheless, that was the historical truth. And thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Anastasia. Matthew, I saw you shaking your head several times to what Anastasia was saying, and also to Stephen. Did you want to comment? Stephen asked a what?
I'm sorry, Stephen has had to go on the phone with one of his patients, so he had to leave. I'm so sorry.
He asked a question, and I didn't know if Matthew remembers it or wants to respond to that, or we can go to another commenter.
I think he talked again about the nature of God.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That was also, thank you, Monty, because that was actually going to be one of my questions, was to remind me, like, okay, what was, I thought it was the similar on the same track as Anastasia was saying. Thank you for sharing that, and also from your clearly well-studied experience and background in this study. I was nodding my head a lot because a lot of the points you were saying are just standard. Although I will say there was one thing that surprises me, and I would love to know, perhaps you could email it, or if it was so simple, you could just state it, if it's a reference out. But I have never come across the claim that there was a disallowance of Gentile Christians to worship with Jewish Christians during the 1st century. During the 2nd century, I could agree with the Ebionite Christians and so forth, but in the second, after Revelation, but like in the 1st century, I think the gospel accounts, some of the gospels seem to be presuming a mixed audience of Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, which
I was thinking about, I'm sorry, I was talking about the Alexandrians in the 3rd century.
Okay, yeah, okay, that helps to clarify in my mind. All right, I was like everything else you were saying was so right on. I'm like, I know.
Yes, I'm sorry, it was my mistake. Is when later on, but also among to what was a Jew and what was not a Jew, and when they were forming the churches and all this, that was that dissent and practices. Yes.
Yeah, no, everything else you were saying was so right on that I figured I must not know something, or I must misunderstand something, because if you got everything else right.
One quick another thing about to make sure, especially for some people who have not studied the classics, and I'm not derogatory, is Hellenism and Hellenistic practices were very different from those, for instance, at the times of the classicism. For if one reads the oration by Pericles and also Plato's and Socrates, actual condemnation of the Olympian gods, Socrates was put to death because of that, and that their leaders, although they did honor those that fought for freedom, but they didn't make them gods at that time. And the freedom although they were men sex, of course, and but the philosophers mean those seeking the truth. And as we know, the parable like of the cave and so on. So it's very different from the Macedonians. Actually, they had sacked Athens, the father of Alexander, and there was animosity there. So Hellenistic history and philosophy, though related to the ancient, is different than the classic.
Yeah, no, I my advisor, Canada Moss, she's a classicist. She knows a lot. That's one of my areas I keep trying to struggle to grow. But I have
It
a
would be
question.
fantastic.
I have a question to ask. Do you read John Dominic Crossan?
You know, I have heard, I have not.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to ask is because what you said sounded so similar to what he wrote in his book with Harper One on Revelation. He said the problem of the Christian Bible is that its God is portrayed both non-violently and violently. Its Christ, proclaimed as the human image of that God, is also portrayed both non-violently and violently, and therefore Christians are called to a life of political confusion at best or religious hypocrisy at worst. Suspect the peace donkey, expect the war horse of Revelation. And so he asks at another point, do we choose and follow one or the other option, since both are presented as the character of the biblical God? But if one Christian chooses God as nonviolent, another may, with equal validity, choose God as violent. Is the answer to my titular how simply it's your choice? Or alternatively, should we mix a transcendental cocktail of so many parts violence and so many parts nonviolence, depending on personal taste or according to denominational tradition? Right. So some tongue-in-cheek comments by a very tongue-in-cheek scholar who is very good. But
title? I'm sorry, I would love to read this book. What is the title of the book?
I forget the title at the moment.
And
If you type in John Dominic Crossan, you'll find a book of his that's about Revelation.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
But so, and I was able to get those quotes quickly because I quote them in my own book. So it's really fast to be like, oh, I remember this. This sounds.
In your book, I would like the title of your book, please.
Saying No to God.
Oh.
But the reason I wanted to mention that was simply because while I can totally appreciate it, I do think that to a degree this illustrates also how we approach text. So for example, you mentioned 1 John as something that would be contradictory and in line with the Gospel of John. But I would argue that you could easily get the same problem with 1 John.
Also anti-Semitic.
Well, not necessarily anti-Semitism, but
some places it could be viewed as. Yeah,
potentially, but in particular in 1 John, everyone is drawn to the first two chapters in regards to the loving, if you don't have love, God is love. This is all great, but turn to chapters 3 to 5, and it talks about the division in the house church, and that if you don't believe the same as we do on the deity of Jesus, then we're splitting you. You're out. You're an anathema. To hell with you. You're gone. And so all of the language, although it sounds wonderful, love your brother, love your neighbor, it's very much only, according to the later chapters of the book, your brother or sister is only those who belong to this house church. The others do not belong there. And I've been in an Adventist church where I had somebody quoted with that knowledge as a justification for why they refuse to go near someone in the Adventist church they disagree with. And so, it's what I'd say is sometimes this text and language, so 1 John sounds great, but it's insidiously promoting a very sectarian kind of thought pattern. On the other hand, Revelation, while it sounds insidious, it also hides a very, I would argue the opposite of how you were painting it, a very gracious view of God, only insofar as if you, for example, look at Revelation 19, the most bloody chapter in the book. Well, maybe not. It depends if you think Jezebel's death is bloodier. But the point is, okay, you've got this whole destruction of all the kings of the earth and the nations. They're all destroyed, seemingly. Now there's a new earth and the kingdom comes down. And what does it tell us in chapter 21? The kings of the earth will come into this new Jerusalem to bring in their glory. Throughout the entire book of Revelation, there are the characters of the kings of the earth and the nations are maintained as consistent titles for a certain character in the text. And a lot of commentators from the conservative tradition, for whatever reason, want to imagine that suddenly that just ended in chapter 21 and that the consistency stops and these are new characters. But if you actually ask yourselves, you say, well, wait, but how could they have died in Revelation 19? And how are they bringing in their glory in 21? Later, it says the tree of life is for the healing of the nations. The nations are, again, the same group that was said to be destroyed in chapter 19, but here they are and they need healing and they're being given it. And I have a paper on submission at a journal, which is why I'm mentioning this, because in the book of Enoch, there's a predecessor in the Jewish tradition to this vision, which is in the Epistle of Enoch, a section of the book of Enoch, First Enoch. And it has the same scenario, although it's with sheep and goats and so forth, but the same thing. Seemingly all the Gentile animals are destroyed. And then suddenly we're hearing that they're in the new kingdom, that they're all there again, all these enemies. And I think what's important to sometimes realize is that sometimes we might think that this is very opposite of the character of God on a literal level, hearing it. But the question also is, what are we lacking from, say, the Jewish culture at the time of Jesus that would have made sense as like a literary device? Is this cathartic? Is this trying to give catharsis to people who feel victimized, but using that as a way to suggest more open possibilities? So I guess I would say I'm more reserved as to whether I think the book of Revelation is opposite of God's character or whether it's written in ways that tries to balance a larger vision of grace against the very real human emotions people feel under oppression.
I'm so sorry on that point, because I don't know of any other denomination, and I have lived it, that takes excerpts out of the book of Revelation, and we are marked, for those of us that keep both the Sabbath and Sunday, we celebrate, we are bearing as early as 6 years ago by a very, very prominent person, not from Loma Linda. Anyway, how did you can put those two things together when a denomination takes certain things out of the book of Revelation and calls the rest of the people just because of the day of Sabbath, like could be any other commandment, and they carry the beast, the mark of the beast? How can you reconcile with a God that Jesus, that curses, that I understand people doing in that, but when they say God told them and revealed to them, and the rest of us believe in that, and we believe in that kind of God that curses and sends pestilences and tortures, and we say as Adventists we don't believe in the purgatory or whatever, but yet we believe in that. And then God keeps Satan for several years, and then he unleashes them out again. How can you reconcile that kind of God and Christ, whatever the other poetry is about or facts are about, where they're directly in opposition with the nature of God? And when a denomination takes that and makes a religion out of it.
So if I can just interject, Matthew, would you please, if you could respond, and then we have other people who would like to ask questions as well.
Absolutely. I think, to keep on time and so we can move on, I think the thing that comes to my mind in several ways is I recognize, and I think so do you from your, although this is different classics from say what we're thinking of as scripture, but from a biblical scholarship point of view, it's not always that distinctly different. I allow the writers of the Bible to very much have mistaken notions and still very much be operating under inspiration. So in this sense, for example, I know that in First Enoch, which is a huge influence on the book of Revelation, according to scholars like Collins and others, because there are multiple references to it in the book of Revelation. In the book of Watchers, the first part of First Enoch, it talks about that Azazel is going to be in the greatest darkness, that he is going to be sent there as a punishment. So part of the imagery that's being employed in Revelation 20 is already pre-described as orthodox for Revelation. Like he has to present these scenarios because they're expected in his day. This is the imagery that comes to mind. So I think that sometimes the conflicts we find are more related to like what the cultural conventions and ways of speaking are. In the same way we might critique Jesus for calling Gentiles dogs, because that was the epithet of use at that time against Gentiles by Jews. So with that having been said, I do think that there's a deeper critique, which is there's what the writer may have imagined in his history. There's how does a religion or denomination choose to employ it? And for example, I think with the Adventist Church, something that is important to point out is that while there are very much, and I've come across them too, ministers, like you mentioned, who associate Sunday keepers, quote unquote, as being those who hold to the beast. But it's very important to note that that was never actually a part of the Adventist tradition officially. Ellen White herself writes copious amounts of time in the 1880s and 90s when she's written by people who say we must resist and protest the Sunday laws in our states. And she writes back and says, Sunday keeping is not the test. She says, you are not to work on Sunday. You are not to provoke people. She said, none of this, nobody keeping Sunday has the beast. Get rid of this idea out of your head. Instead, she says, you should make Sunday a day of worship for God. There's a line where she literally writes this in one of her letters. She says, dedicate Sunday to God, have church services, do things. And the problem is that as with the Bible, we like to pick and choose the traditions that agree with us. And I think that it says more about humanity than the inspiration, as we see various Christians and Adventists and others selectively choose, oh, this is the vision I want to promote, because it is a choice they're making, because there are other resources they could draw on for their transcendental cocktail, as Crossan would point out.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
One second.
Anastasia, I'm going to
In
have
my
us move on.
experience,
Anastasia, I'm going to stop you there. We're going to move on. We'll bring you back in if we can. I know there's different experiences.
I want to say that was not my experience by the church and
All right.
church leaders. And in this class, there was a lady that we're talking about abortion, that said Sunday keepers will bring the Armageddon because they believe in a soul. And it happened now.
Yeah.
So
There are a wide variety of perspectives in the Adventist Church. Absolutely. I want to go to McKinley and then Rod.
Thank you, Monty. I hope I can do this very quickly. I don't have questions, but I do have a couple of quick comments. I hesitate to offer my comments given the presenter's august background. If she were present, I would put a question or two to her. Nevertheless, I offer these thoughts about the presentation, looking at application and implications. First, a general comment about the series of perspectives on Revelation. I'm approaching the presentations and features as intellectual best efforts to explain the content, meaning, and relevance of the book of Revelation to the Christian experience by Transform. By Transform, I am thinking of the approach used in mathematics, physics, or engineering, where a really difficult problem, like a second or third order differential equation, is changed in an algebraic expression, solving the solution, and that solution being applied to the original problem. Or a problem that cannot be solved analytically may have a numerical solution. So to do so, I'm applying 5 screening or test questions to these series of presentations. 1, does the approach add to my baseline knowledge? 2, does it advance my understanding? 3, is it consistent with the fundamentals? 4, does it explain observed physical and human phenomena? And of course, 5, for spiritual application, is it consistent with the teaching, ministry, purpose, mission, and character of the Lord Jesus Christ? My assessment of this presentation, it wasn't initially clear whether the presenter was treating the book as literature, a theological treatise, or a combination. her conclusion suggests a treatment as literature. I gave her high marks for the introduction and references to other works and approaches. In particular, I think one that drew my attention was the work of Elizabeth Scholze, I believe. Her talk confirms several elements of the classical Adventist treatment. For example, there's references to Rome and the Seven Hills and other parts of her talk. But, and I hope I'm not being harsh here, I gave her 0 marks for unsupported speculation and hypothesis. I will refer to the 2 bullets in her conclusion. I gave her 0 marks for spiritual application. And when I compare the presentation to the classical Adventist treatment of the book of Revelation, I think the classical Adventist perspective survives the professor's perspective. The 2 points in her conclusion that I have difficulty with is that she says the work, she characterizes Revelation as a work of religious poetry inspired by the prophets, I can't read my writing, and the myths of the period. And then the second part that I have a difficulty with is she says it is also religious rhetoric intended to, I guess, suppress beliefs and lifestyles of its audience. So that's what I took away from her talk. And again, if she were present, I would put a question to her. How does her perspective, how does she reconcile her perspective with observed societal issues? Thank you.
All right, thank you, McKinley. Rod.
The seeds of my disappointment in the presentation probably have to do with my expectation, as they usually are. I was looking forward to some kind of, I guess, a structured presentation on what the Catholics and various Protestant religions believe in the current time. There's a real upsurge out there, not just in the public press, but in movies and TV dramas and that, in terms of the apocalypse in the last days. And as an Adventist who was brought up indoctrinated on the traditional Adventist position, I've never heard a presentation on what do others believe. And I was hoping to get that today, which I didn't, and I tried to listen very hard. When I think of the conclusion, I'm a little bit like McKinley here. My conclusion would be there is nothing of material or physical or metaphysical importance in the book of Revelation, and it is poetry for the ages. And yes, one can focus on people at the margin, but one can read a lot of New Testament and scriptural material about people on the margin. So in terms of it advancing me forward of my knowledge, it simply didn't do that at all. Right? It was a very academic, intellectual critique, and I'm okay with that now that I understand that what is going to be delivered. But in terms of any kind of practical application, if I was to go to a school reunion, a high school reunion, my college reunion today, and people would ask me in Australia, say, Rod, there's a lot of noise coming out of America about the Adventist position on Revelation, and I would say to them 2 things. Is yes, there is historical perspectives from the Wild West back in the 40s and 50s and 60s that we grew up on, but there is no consensus amongst Adventist theologians on this position. And as farmers, unless you're of a very strong intellectual disposition and highly curious, you need to leave this alone. Leave it alone. You're not going to be able to work it through. Let's wait and see if clarity comes from somebody else or a group of other speakers. But at the moment, I see the Adventist position in flux.
All right, thank you, Rod. Let's go to Peter.
I appreciated very much the description of the book that our presenter made. And I appreciated especially the fact that she made a connection between the Revelation and the book of Daniel. Two books go together and somehow they explain each other. John, even Dr. Jones, he mentioned that she'll help us with the reading of the book of Revelation, a good reading. And I would say this is exegesis. And she did an okay job with that, in my view. But our problem starts when we try to look at the hermeneutics, the interpretation, what is under the surface of the text. And there is a lot of disagreement about this, because as we discussed last Sabbath, this is a book written in code. And the code is deciphered by many people in many ways. She mentioned, and to add to the comment of Dr. Jones, I will add also, I like to comment, short comment on Matthew's comment. I was surprised that he mentioned here in this discussion Dominique Crossan. I read most of Dominique Crossan's books, and we know he was one of the leading figures of Jesus Seminar. And he is a very, very controversial person, very controversial scholar. And he made some outrageous statements about Jesus. And I will mention one of them. Of course, he made many. But the majority of scholars that talk about his books and his statements, they are doing this in a critical way. For example, he mentioned that Jesus' resurrection was not a bodily resurrection. And this is a statement that doesn't agree with the scriptures. This is a fantasy statement. And he is making many other statements like that. Then again, I was surprised that Matthew is quoting his Crossan as an authority. And he mentioned the statement that God is presented either as a loving God or a revengeful God. Well, I would say that the Bible is presenting God loving and just. And justice and love are meeting in God. Both of them are characteristic of God. A few observations about the way she explains things. First, about
Peter, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, Peter, can we go with? You've talked about a number of things. I think we're at 12:30 already. I'd like to have Matthew and John have an opportunity to respond to your comments, and I'm also interested in hearing from Donna. If we have,
okay, then you are not interested in my taking on basically how she presented the things.
Well, I was interested in your first perspective. Now I want to continue on and come back to you if we have time.
Okay.
John or Matthew, did you want to respond?
John, do you want to go first?
Matthew, let me quickly defer to you first. I went first last time.
Okay. So to clarify, in case it was not clear, I was not quoting Crossan as an authority. I was quoting Crossan as, obviously I disagreed with him. I quoted him in the sense of someone who seemed to be agreeing with the concerns that Anastasia was mentioning. And I mentioned that my view was different, or at least my reservations were different. So I certainly wasn't quoting him as an authority in that moment. But to be clear, Crossan is not controversial outside of evangelical beliefs. So, and also just in general Christian theology. So when I reference Crossan, for the most part, if he's an authority, it's as a New Testament scholar. And in that regard, he has high esteem amongst all scholars, including evangelicals. But when he wants to suppose something theological, like what is my belief as a Catholic about the resurrection of Jesus, well, then that's outside his field. He's not a theologian. He's primarily a biblical scholar. So I don't quote him as a theologian, and that wouldn't be where I would be in agreement with him, nor would any. But anybody who you might be thinking of, Darrell Bach, N.T. Wright, any of these people who criticize Crossan's theological beliefs would in a heartbeat quote his scholarly works on the New Testament. So just to be clear, even the Jesus Seminar, for the sort of mockery it gets, if you ask any of the scholars who mock it, who themselves are doing historical Jesus work, whether or not the Jesus Seminar in principle was wrong, they'll tell you no, it's not. They just found the specific methodology that the Jesus Seminar tried to do as a little bit over the top. So just to clarify, there's a nuance to this amongst scholars that is not always clear when they write for a popular audience. When they write for a popular audience, they're trying to appeal to masses. When they write their scholarly articles, they're in a very different kind of form and approach. So just to clarify why I was quoting him was just because he represented something that was being said. And I think Crossan's concerns are shared by others, but they were not being quoted because they're my own concerns. But either way, I would just say, having noted that, I think it's also important to understand about where Dr. Collins is coming from in her talk, is that she is approaching this only insofar as the restraints are at that place. Wherever she is, it's very clear it's a historian sort of sphere. She's giving a talk in regards to where her specialty is, which is the history of Revelation. So she might very well have her own belief system, theology, ideas, applications, but that's not where she feels comfortable being able to share that. So if she had given this in a church setting, it may have been a very different sort of talk she felt comfortable to give. But in this setting, her goal was only to give so much as whatever anyone at a historical level could understand and agree with. That means that, for example, if I go to speak at the Society of Biblical Literature, like I will be this November, my paper has to be written such that a Buddhist, a Hindu, an Islamic scholar, or a Christian scholar can all listen and say, this is what the evidence suggests. And that means that there's a certain limit at which, if I go beyond that, I'm engaging in theology. And that's good, not bad, but it's just beyond where that setting is, allowing. And so in that respect, I think we should very much embrace theology and try to think of applications, and that should be what we as a religious believing community do. But we should also respect that in order to put the pieces of the puzzle in the way we want to create the image we wish, or that, to use better language, to create the image we feel the Holy Spirit is leading us to create. Nonetheless, we should respect, well, what are the puzzle pieces? And I think that's where people like Dr. Collins and myself and so forth, we obsess more about what the puzzle pieces are to get them right than we do about the overall picture. Because for some theologians, they don't have any training in biblical studies, so they just start trying to create a picture without knowing if each of those pieces are real. And so it has a lot to do with field of study and professional differences. John, what would you like to piggyback on that?
Thank you, Matthew. First of all, with a glance at the clock, what I would add is a quick amen. I think you've articulated that well. We are going to continue in this as we move forward with Sigve Tonstad and others to face the fact that we have to make choices as readers to how we shall read. And Crossan is saying, well, which way do you want to read? The God of love and mercy, or the God of not only justice, but of outright vengeance? And I think there are going to be movements in our own nation that drive this quandary, that force us to think about which eyeglasses we wear. But as Matthew has well articulated, that moves to the level of theology. And I think for today, we are wise to maintain the distinction between textual analysis as biblical readers versus faith statements under the umbrella of theology.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Simona, we are now at 12:40.
Let's have Donna or Jeff. I don't know who is there,
all right.
and then we will close. Yes.
Sounds good. Thank you. Donna or Jeff?
Yeah, well, it's Donna. I have a very brief statement. First of all, I found Professor Collins' presentation superb. I listened to it once before the class. I found her easy and clear to follow as a textual critic, as John has just described. I think she's amazing because she is obviously a woman, one might call an intellectual giant, and also a believing, church-involved member of the Christian community. I didn't go on to talk about that she gives sermons, that she's involved in teaching in her local congregation, that she's not a person who lives just in an ivory tower. And I find that very comforting. I also find her things characterized as speculations. I think we have to be very careful before we label things that she has said as merely speculative. Remember, this is a very short presentation by a woman who has studied and written and been involved with biblical scholarship for decades. She's not someone whose presentation can be judged merely on the last 45 minutes. And so there are people who speculate and do so with more authority, or if we don't like the word authority, then we can say on better grounds than some of the rest of us. And finally, the last thing, and the theologians can confirm or disconfirm this, I had always understood that a lot of our Adventist interpretations of the book of Revelation derive much of their particulars from Martin Luther, who obviously had a really big grudge against the Catholic Church, not unreasonably, but whose identification of various symbols in the book of Revelation might be questioned by a good psychologist. That's all.
All right. Thank you very much, Donna. Back to you, Simona.
Thank you very much for the very, very interesting and insightful discussion. And I always appreciate your comments. One thing that I like to consider is this. We all come from different backgrounds. We have different understanding. We have different experiences. We have different knowledge. These differences give us different insights, which are enriching all of us. And in these different insights, we should be respectful that other people may not see it that way, and accept that other people's views in something that none of us truly know should be at least respected and taken into consideration. I am sorry that sometimes there are people who have little knowledge and little understanding give judgments of other people based on their own beliefs and their own worldview. I think that is a step too far. Everybody has the right to believe. We don't have the right to judge what other people believe, or to judge them based on what they believe or based on their practice. I think that's an important rule in the way how we treat each other and how we talk to each other, and how we view comments of those people who are making such comments without understanding and without knowledge. So let's not generalize individual experiences with the entire church and what the entire church stands for. I think that is also very important. I'm very grateful to Matthew and John, who came and spent time with us and gave us their considerable amounts of experience and knowledge in discussing this subject, which is a scholarly subject, and I think it's important to stress this. And I very much appreciated your views and your ability to give us an insight based on your knowledge and your experience. And thank you so much for joining us. You're always welcome back. You know, I hope you know that. And I'm going to close today's session with a part of a poem called Desiderata, Words for Life, Matthew, written by Max Ehrmann almost 100 years ago in 1927. Take kindly the counsel of the years, gracefully surrendering the things of youth. Nurture strength of spirit to shield you in sudden misfortune. But do not distress yourself with dark imaginings. Many fears are born of fatigue and loneliness. Beyond a wholesome discipline, be gentle with yourself. You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here. And whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should. Therefore, be at peace with God, whatever you conceive him to be, and whatever your labors and aspirations. In the noisy confusion of life, keep peace with your soul. With all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. Be cheerful. Strive to be happy. And our blessing is, let the majesty of the Father be the light by which you walk. The compassion of the Son be the love by which you walk. The presence of the Spirit be the power by which you walk. Amen. Have a good week.
Beautiful,
And
Simona.
we are
Thank you.
going to continue with our digital foodless potluck after we stop this. And I'm hoping to see all of you next Sabbath. Thank you.